the good old famous NIMBY, not in my backyard phrase keeps coming up. And I wanted to bring Ryan on here to talk about it
NIMBY?
because,
Is that
yeah,
a real phrase that people use?
yeah, not in my
Jeez.
backyard. So I really wanted to bring Ryan on to have these conversations because when we talk about the polling and we talk about the issues that matter a lot to young voters and voters, housing is polling very high. So Ryan, welcome. Why don't we start with your background? Give us some background of how you got into this industry. You and I were just chatting. I had no idea you had 5 years in the service, so thank you very much for sharing. So I'll pass it over to you and welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Going back, I joined the Army out of high school, right? I didn't have a ton of money, wanted to do more in life, so, needed to go to college. Spent 5 years there. I went to Indiana University. While I was at Indiana University, started getting interested in politics, so I've helped a few people on their campaigns, which, kind of snowballed into an internship at the mayor's office where I learned that housing was kind of the main interest I had as far as like actually getting things done on my own. I became a caseworker for Section 8, and I did that for 3 years, and I oversaw about 300 families there, 300 households in Monroe County. From there, I got on the Board of Housing Quality Appeals, oversaw if there were like renters that had a complaint within the city of Bloomington and the landlord didn't address that properly, they would take that to us and we would see if we should give them more time or if there should be a fine or something along those lines. After that, I applied for and was accepted to my current position where now I develop affordable housing. Right now at our group, we're making permanent supportive housing. We've made an early learning center that'll have affordable housing above it. We have a land trust, which is for purchase for single family homes that'll be affordable as well. We're looking at all the options here. I also should mention that I helped, during the political side, helped start the Indiana Rural Summit, which helps statehouse candidates that are interested in helping our rural communities.
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot there to dissect because when we start talking about housing, I look at it from so many different lenses because you've got these buckets that housing falls into. First of all, you have where Josh and I come in, you have the messaging bucket where as soon as you say affordable housing, people get triggered. They get triggered thinking that, you mentioned the term Section 8. I want to start there. What is Section 8, first of all? And let's talk about and start defining affordable housing because when we say affordable housing, that has stretched because to me, it's about having that starter home, that place to call home, that place that's safe. And when we say affordable housing, the voter thinks that, or someone's reading about affordable housing projects or things that potentially could help people into that first home or move from renting and home ownership. They think they're getting a leg up. They're getting something that I didn't get. So talk to me, what is Section 8? You had some experience in that. And what do we mean by affordable housing?
Absolutely. Section 8 it means different things to like inside the community and in the public. So I'll stick with what's in the public. In the public, basically it's defined as a housing choice voucher or just a voucher that you can take out to a landlord within the community, and then the housing authority would cover a portion of your rent. You would still pay, in this scenario, you still pay 30% of your monthly income in rent, so it's not necessarily a free ride. I'll also say that I know I've gotten a lot of pushback over the years about like Section 8 and vouchers, and I'll say we had, of the 300 some households, that I personally oversaw, the majority of them, and by majority I should even go up to about 70-80%, were either people that were living with a disability or people that were working or people that were retired. Many times people had more than one job. It's not, the vast majority of it isn't people that are just like living off the government or whatever thing you usually hear from people. It is mostly working class people that are just trying to do their best. Now, when you get into like defining affordable housing, this is something that I don't even like to do, and I'm in the field, right? It's one of those things that it's messy, and every few years they change the term because people don't like what the term is. So at this moment in time, affordable housing mostly refers to some sort of like government subsidized thing, and that doesn't just mean vouchers, right? A large amount of housing is affordable housing is for sale, for purchase, right? And that's when you see things like the community development block grant or home or things like that. that can help lower the cost of housing even for sale. A term that people like to use now is attainable housing. Attainable housing is kind of used to separate out the affordable aspect, where you're looking at what percentage of people can purchase this. That's usually determined by area median income. And when you get into like what's affordable, typically people are looking at like below 120% of the area median income. People kind of want to push that lower. I've heard calls to push it to 80% or below, which is certainly reasonable.
What's interesting to me is we had the GI Bill. When all people came back, and in the 1950s and the 1960s, that's how people got into home ownership and started their own pathway to home ownership and having their own personal wealth. And we stopped that. We stopped that government community collective giving people the ability to get started in life. I kind of go scratch my head, because when you talk about those block grants, why is that any different? We provided that before, and now we're saying we shouldn't be doing that.
The GI Bill is still very much a thing. It's I actually used it to buy the home that I'm in. The community development block grants are still used. There's been some calls by the current administration to stop that altogether or reduce it. This is one of those weird areas where Congress's kind of inability to do anything has helped, in that they've only done continuing resolutions, which means that the CDBG fund, the home funds, they continue to exist, right? If they actually passed a budget on their own, we probably see that decrease.
So I think something our candidates are seeing a lot is that even what you said, well, 70, 80%, even if you were to say 80% of people are working, are have a disability, X, Y, or Z. The argument that our progressive candidates here is, well, I know, like, what are you doing to stop the other 20%, right? Like, because there's that argument of, like, I get that this would be good in theory, but there are people who take advantage. We heard that with the food stamps, and we hear that with attainable housing. So I'm curious, you've been on both sides of it, right? Actually doing this work, but then also working in the political space. How do we talk about that? How do we combat that kind of, well, I just don't want to be helping lazy people type of an argument?
The explanation that I usually give is mildly confusing, so please stop me if I need to re-explain this. In any system where you're assisting people, right, you have to have some sort of reporting. So typically when someone's on a Section 8 or a voucher, they will report their income, they'll report any disability or Social Security, retirement, any type of income they get that way. The more difficult you make to report that, right? So let's say that you wanted to require, work requirements or disability or whatever. The people that are working, you have to, if you want to require that, you'd have to have them report their income more frequently, right? That's how you would stop that. There are people that hold a job for a little bit and then quit and then get, right? So every time they'd have to report that again, that they do that, that becomes a legitimate barrier at some point. If every month I tell you I need you to provide me with 4 weeks of income and I need to correlate this with your employer, eventually employers get angry, right? Like I've had employers be genuinely unhappy that I'm like, hey, I need you to fill out this sheet saying this person works for you and is paid this amount of money. So you have to balance out how much you want to stop people that aren't working versus how much you want to hassle or inconvenience people that are doing everything right. And at a certain point, it gets like, I can tell you this, when we would request income information from groups, national employers like fast food chains, supermarkets, whatever, we'd never get that info back. So if you want to, they just don't respond. So if you wanted to say you have to have your employer verify all your stuff, then you're looking at people that work for these national chains, they'll just never qualify because their employers won't return this information. So it's one of those balancing acts. And I know that's not I can't condense that into a little soundbite. So I know it's not great as far as messaging goes, but it's this way in every sort of system where you're just helping out people. You have to balance out reporting requirements with actually getting the aid out to the house.
When I hear you say people are doing everything right, that's what I struggle with because, you think about in Indiana. Last quarter, 2020 had the highest number of foreclosures across the country. We had the highest number of foreclosures in Indiana across the country. People are losing their housing, the housing that they had. And what I hear and what I see when people are talking about it and talking to prospective candidates, they're working. They're working 40 hours a week. They're doing it. The utility bills are going up. Their dollars aren't stretched. In Indiana, look at the minimum wage. We are still on the federal minimum. We haven't raised the minimum wage here in Indiana. So how do we, there's a lot of barriers to entry. We've got people in home. We've got so many different things happening here. We got people in homes who are losing the ability to stay in their homes. We have people in the housing and renting that are struggling to move and create that stability from getting from renting to own home ownership to create their own family wealth. And then we have people who are graduating, who did everything right, and they want to move out of the family home, and that's not possible either. What's blocking all this? Where's the roadblocks? Where is the barriers? Where's the bottleneck that is really causing this generation to not be able to move to the next level of life?
Yeah. There's, as in everything, there's more than one factor. Like the base cause of all of this is wage stagnation. Like it's very clear and obvious to see wages haven't gone up with the house of pricing at all. And it's any graph you look at, any info you look at, you're going to see housing costs continue to rise and rise. Wages don't. And as long as that happens, you're going to see more and more people that don't fit in the system. And that's how it will be until that's fixed. There are things you can do on the housing side of that to kind of ease that burden, to ease that gap, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things you mentioned is people graduating and getting into their first home. Mm-hmm. Entry-level homes, with the cost of materials and labor even, it can get to the point where you wouldn't really be able to build a home nowadays for that entry-level cost. The average cost of a new home in Indiana is around $430,000. That obviously does not fit even close to minimum wage. That doesn't even work for people that are making, $70,000, $80,000 a year.
Not even close, yeah. Right?
So you have to look at a way to kind of make homes affordable for them, and you don't get there without some sort of non-refundable source in there, without some sort of grant, without someone taking a loss as it will. Yeah, that's a good graph.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is like not a partisan graph. It's just an actual math, and you can see the difference, and this only goes back as far as 85 even. And so it's hard because sometimes it feels like it's an education gap when we're talking with people, right? Like when candidates are talking with their constituents, there's kind of this, how we get these kickbacks that they saw on Fox News or social media or something like that, where they're not understanding the full situation. So I think we end up doing a lot of this education surrounding it, but how much can you really educate someone who's not interested in being educated? So I'm curious, from your perspective, like, how do we go about this in a way, like, we can't just tagline it out, like you said. So there has to be some kind of balance between, like, I can't explain the crumbling economic system in which we're living in to you in 2 minutes on your front step, but also I need to give you something. Like, how do we go about that?
Yeah, I think the reality in which we're living has lended itself to more people understanding this. And I think that's why you've seen even Republican or like conservative, even politicians and government officials actually recognizing this and moving for some steps to fix it. If there's a person out there today that doesn't truly understand that housing isn't affordable for the vast majority of people, I would find that confusing. Like, I don't know how you would live in this world. And I know I work with it directly, so I see it more than most people, I imagine. Mm-hmm. But, even well-off people that I've spoken to can usually say something along the lines of, like, oh, I'm worried about my kids or my grandkids, they can't seem to find a house, they have a good job. It's so pervasive at this point that I think that it's noticeable. And I know that's, maybe not the best answer you're hoping for, because I'm not giving you something to say, but it's such a part of our reality at this point.
No, I think that feels true.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's why we're seeing candidates be able to say, "Oh, affordability is a like I'm almost sick of hearing that already." Because it's people are seeing that in all of their pricing right away now. So it's almost a filling in the blank situation. It's just a matter of how do we help them understand that these systems are a way to help people move forward in their life rather than just the kind of idea that we propping them up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. What states, because when I was diving into this, I kept coming across zoning. When I look at, going back to my opening statement about NIMBYs, not in my backyard, what they're complaining about is multiple units in their subdivisions. I remember driving around Boston and, as a young child, and that's where I'm from, it was not uncommon in Brighton and Brookline and Allston to have the three-deckers. I mean, that was very normal. It was okay. That's why you lived in some of these slightly outside the city suburbs. And then you had the duplexes where you had two right next to each other, and that seems to be becoming taboo. Like it's not okay to do that anymore. And how do we solve that? I mean, you've got zoning people like Costco coming up with some really creative ideas where they're building housing above on top of Costco to solve the zoning. Basically, they're saying, we've got it already zoned, we're going to do it for you. So is part of the problem that creativity piece of thinking outside the box and really looking at what we're doing in our local communities with the zoning? Is that a place where we can start to turn the dial to find more places for starter homes and move folks into stable homes?
Absolutely. And that's my main recommendation, right? When you look at things on the federal level, when you look at things even on the state level, it's hard to find somewhere where you can get involved and actually make a change. One area where you can do that is at the local level. Zoning regulations are out of control. If you look at any of the housing that exists from 100 years ago, most of that doesn't fit into modern zoning. You couldn't build town squares like you could 100 years ago. And most housing, which is like duplex and multifamily housing, is so opposed in many neighborhoods that it's priced people out. And that's a major fault. But if we see the people that are affected by this, which vastly outnumbers the people that aren't, actually get involved, support candidates that are here to change zoning regulations, then that's something that we can really see a change in. And I can say locally in Bloomington, we've started that process. That's something that I'm looking forward to. I know, like, statewide, there's other communities that are doing the same. I've talked to a few people from, like, Carmel, and I've heard about some things happening in Hammond, where they're looking at different rules that they can do, not just with zoning, but some I've heard of people taxing extra properties and things like that. I guess New York just did that. It's a big news story at the moment. So
right, yeah, the vacant extra properties, right?
Yeah. And if you look at what we can do locally, I think we'll get a lot more done. As with anything, it's going to require national attention, but locally we can definitely ease the burden for a lot of people.
So, from your perspective, working on both sides of things, how can candidates make a difference in this space, whether they're running for political office or whether they're in political office? Like, this is obviously, you've worked on the nonprofit side and supporting candidates. So how do we merge together best to actually make a change, at least at the local level?
Okay, I can cover local and state level there because and some ideas for both. Locally, obviously, is making the least restrictive zoning you can. The word you guys keep using, NIMBY. NIMBYs hate that word. They hate it. They get really mad about it. But if you can run for office under the idea of, I will lessen the burden of zoning regulations here, you'll see a direct impact of that. There are groups, there are nonprofits that go around and pretty much their whole ideal is to go talk to municipalities and say, hey, your zoning requirements are bad because of XYZ, and if you were to remove those, you would see more housing being developed in your neighborhood.
What are the other positive impacts with that? Because I think people have this misconceived notion that changing those zoning laws to open up the opportunity for multi-unit units for housing, there's that negative connotation. But what's the positive flip side besides having new people have access to homes?
Well, you also see, on top of giving, entry-level homes to people, which is extremely important, you see a lot of people that downsize with old age, right? They can find a right-sized home. And then you get kind of two benefits from that. They get to live in a home where they can actually maintain it. They don't have to worry about, exorbitant maintenance costs, or maybe stairs become an issue. I mean, you're talking about aging in place at this point. You want to find somewhere where you can live out the rest of your life that isn't a nursing home. It's a very popular idea right now. And then once they move out of their older homes, which usually have 3 or 4 bedrooms, that opens up those homes to the market, which can be, you'll find expanding families that'll be able to move into that. So it's on top of just economically, like for society, I think it's a big plus to give people the options that they need.
Makes a lot of sense, because I know, working with the county down in Shelby County, when they talk about what they stand for, it's making sure all generations have a safe place to stay. And you mentioned a very important factor. I address this, or having as a family with my mom, aging in place. And one of the big concerns of folks that they want to stay in their homes is stairs. And if we can, shift that, and, they move out of their homes that were 2 and 3 bedrooms that they can't take care of anymore, that it's financially doesn't make sense, but they want to stay in their community. And yet the other thing is, you hit the nail on the head on this one, was a lot of people that generation cannot afford. They can downsize, they can stay in their homes, they might be able to have a little help in their homes. The cost of assisted living is so outrageous for many, many families. This also helps solve that problem and ease that burden. Yeah. So we talked about the local level. Can you get a little bit more specific, let's say the local level for a second, about when we say change the zoning? What does that look like? What do we have to do in terms of change the zoning?
Typically, and I can describe this best through the lens of Bloomington, although I think most resemble this. When you look at what zoning is, it's a list of rules and regulations that dictate what certain areas of your city can have as far as buildings. They're typically designed to include like an area for downtown, an area for kind of like a residential, and then a commercial area, and it varies between there. When I say change zoning specifically, one of the larger things that I want is that, I believe would help is increased density. Density is one of those words that, again, people seem to get upset about. But realistically, that just means having more housing in a tighter area. It helps because when you purchase some land to develop a house, you buy the land. If you put one house on there, whoever buys that house is paying for the land, right? If you put 2 houses on there, now the cost of the land is split between 2 people. 4, then it's split between 4 people. This is kind of a natural way of making that cost dilute amongst a lot of people and then make it affordable. So the more density you have in an area, the better. And that doesn't have to be dense everywhere, right? I haven't heard anyone say we should go out to the middle of a rural area and build a skyscraper. That's not something. That's one of.
Not been listening to my other podcast, because that is all we talk about: skyscrapers in farmland.
Well, I'm wrong then. Look at that.
But I think the other thing that people are afraid of, they don't see the other positive sides of this, because when you are talking about this, staying on the local level before we start about the state level, is when you have more people in a community, that's more tax-based revenue coming in. That's more generation of, I'm going to the coffee shop, I am going to the local convenience store, I'm using the other amenities, I'm going to the local cafe, the restaurants. It's a way to boost the community and lift the quality of life in that area and bring in new development. So there's a lot of positives if we can get beyond the mental block that increasing density is a negative.
Yeah. And what you're touching on there, if I were to condense it, would be the word walkability. That's something that every architect, developer, builder that I know of strives for walkability at this point. It's what most home buyers say they want. They want to be able to walk to a coffee shop that's not far from them. They want to be able to walk to a store that satisfies whatever needs they need. These are things that are heavily desired, and they're things that can be achieved.
Yeah,
I think it's beyond walkability though, Josh. It's community. When you start walking instead of just getting in your car and going everywhere, you meet all the other people walking the dogs because I have a dog, and you meet your other neighbors a little bit more easily, right? That community connection is really what this generation coming up wants. And I know, as folks that I know have talked about in this area, our elderly really need, because if we could walk a little bit more, there's that feeling of community gets just stronger.
Absolutely.
Curious what I know you've Indiana Rural Summit, so you've worked a lot in the rural spaces. I'm curious, how we talk about and how attainable housing work in the different kind of areas of, Americana, like how does it work in a city versus in a suburb versus in these rural counties? Like how do we, like, is there a big difference, or like, because we
There,
have candidates working in all these different spaces, and it's, do I just say the same thing, or how's it different?
yeah, there's certainly differences, and I would even market it differently. Where if I'm working in a truly rural area, then I actually would talk about the idea of like preserving the character, right? If you live in a small town, it's because you want to live in a small town, right? Like you want to be in a place that feels like a smaller community. So I wouldn't go there, and I wouldn't want to build massive units. You know what I mean? I would focus more on duplexes or single family homes or smaller lots or something like that. Give people the ability to afford their home, but not make it something that would be offensive to the community. And if you're talking about like more urban areas, that's where you find a lot more like townhomes, apartment buildings, stuff like that. And that fits the character there more. I usually shy away from talking about character so much because I think that's mostly used as an excuse to kind of block out housing that,
I see.
that works only, it's used by people that already have housing and kind of want to block out everything else so that they can keep what's theirs, right? And I don't like that necessarily, but I think you can understand that but still respect the idea that you want to go to a small town and build something that's completely out of place, and you want to match the community to some degree. And that's doable with this, like it's called missing middle, right? When you talk about townhomes or duplexes, that style of housing, it can work in most communities, even rural.
I came across that term a lot in my reading over the last couple of weeks, missing middle. Can you expand on that? Because that's a term that's getting used a lot out there. So I'd love to hear your experience with that and what that truly represents.
It truly is kind of the span between single family homes and large apartment complexes. So it really is townhomes, tiny homes, manufactured modular, duplexes, fourplexes, things, anything in between those. It's the area you see generally between like a town square and a suburban area. It's typically the more affordable aspects of housing, right? Because if you look at a single family home, typically the most expensive. If you look at apartment buildings, that's not for sale, right? People generally want to, not everyone, but enough people do. So that's why that missing middle exists. Or needs.
Okay, I see. Yeah. So when we start looking at this, especially last session here in Indiana at the state level, and I see this happening across the states, when I see them trying to address housing and attainable housing, they seem to try to tackle it from the angle of permits, easing the permitting burden on the developers. And for my spidey sense, my red flag goes up when it seems to be, for lack of a better word, siding with the developers. I'm like, wait a minute, they don't need more money. They're making hand over fist when they develop these houses, and especially where I'm from, where some of our representatives, Linda Rogers and Dale Devon, they got big D's behind their name, and those aren't Democrat D's. Those are developer D's. They are always looking for an angle to increase their ability to freely go in and have less of a burden, and then they can go in and do whatever they need in whatever development of projects they choose to. What's the slippery slope there when we see that the permit is being eased? What are they really getting at?
So there's a counterintuitive thing happening here. It's developers, the big style national developers, can afford to go in, they can afford these long drawn out processes where they have to go through permitting, where they have to pay all these separate fees, and then they can develop housing, and then they're going to charge a lot of money for it because they spent all this time doing it. And they've recently, large developers have decided on a method where they will, instead of like creating a large 100 units and saying, we'll keep this at like 6% vacancy, now they're like, we'll keep this at 30% vacancy, we'll charge way more for it, and then we'll even out our costs. Where if you actually went back and you took back some of those permitting fees and some of that wait time, you could actually have local people that are interested, local developers come in, and they care generally more for their community. And I find it odd that I'm in the situation where I don't want to say against regulation. Generally, I find it, generally regulations exist because there was a problem, someone was taking advantage of people, and then we decided, we need to stop this. When it comes to housing, that isn't how all these regulations came about. Most of the regulations in housing came about from, early periods where people of color were kind of like expanding where they live. And then you get redlining, you get zoning, you get these things that are meant to protect wealthier, wider neighborhoods and then kind of leave behind others. And that's not the only reason that a lot of these exist. There is, in the last 20 years, NIMBYs have come up with a lot of regulation to keep communities how they want them. And there can be racial undertones there as well, but
can be. I'm sure it never happens, but it can be.
We just saw Wells Fargo just got caught in North Carolina. They just got caught with racial discrimination with loans that they were distributing and accessing and giving people the red flag. So we know it exists.
Doing something less than ethical?
Yeah, you would think, right?
I know. Surprise, surprise. It's not like they gave money to the Taliban or anything.
Right. I want to talk about this other thing. We talked about the state level. There's two things I want to dive into that you mentioned is before we go to the state level, because I knew I was going to come to this conversation with a lot of questions and really curious because this is something that we have to really dive into and keep talking about. Permitting fees. You described that structure. Who are the permitting fees? Who's getting that money?
That money is paid out generally to municipalities. There's some paid out to the state as well. From what I can tell, and I'm not on their side of things, they don't seem to be making a lot of money off it. It seems to be the delays that are the largest issue. And I can help with this in a little bit because when you develop, generally you'll purchase a property and then you'll have your plan for it. When you purchase that property, if you are anyone other than a large scale developer, you're going to take out a loan. And while you're holding on to that loan, going through this process, and it takes longer and longer, you're paying more fees on that loan. You're paying interest. And that stacks up, and that cost eventually has to get passed down to the user, especially if you are like a small scale or local developer. You don't necessarily have the funds or the equity to really keep that cost to yourself.
Okay, that makes sense because, when I think about what we're going through the data centers and it goes to the area land commission, it goes to the county council, it goes to the county commissioner, that does take time. And, it just, when you said fees, is like, okay, who's getting this money? Where is it going? It sounds like to me that the process in and of itself is what slows down the developmental process, not necessarily the fees, because the longer it takes, the more they have to pass those costs on to the consumer at the end of the day. Okay. Let's talk about the state level. What are you seeing happening across the country that is easing the burden or paving a more smoother path for this process to happen so we get more attainable housing? Let's look at Indiana first, but is there any other state? My second part of that question, is there any state getting it right?
Yeah. So in Indiana, I think we had a chance with SB1 this year, which the state Senate made so that they could kind of peel back some of the issues with housing. It ended up not having any teeth to it, which was the biggest issue that I found, right? A lot of the things that they were proposing were like automatic acceptance if your project is delayed for a certain amount of time, at the county or the city level. If they take more than let's say 60 days to approve it, then it's approved, right? And that's not saying they can't deny it. That's saying It's just sitting on someone's desk for 60 days. It's not getting addressed. There's things like if going through and making sure that communities have some sort of plan and that the dollars they're putting towards affordable development are working well. There was a reporting requirement for it, but in the end it got taken out. So now it's just kind of like an optional thing where they can report if they've had like meetings with the community about how to change their zoning laws. It was a little disappointing to see the end result of it. I will say this is generally seen as kind of like a first step, right? Like the first time that a state house does this type of thing to kind of like push local communities to do more or to be more accessible. It generally doesn't go through, and then, next year, the year after, they'll go and they'll actually put forth the measures that are needed to make it work.
Yeah. It sounds like to me that what I'm getting out of this conversation, and I'm glad we're having it, is when we're talking about the messaging angle and how to address this, safe homes, attainable homes, we have to start pushing back against our local leaders in terms of being able to create communities and the development we want to see. And there's more power in our local zoning, our local county commissioners, our city councils. And that's where we can start pushing back and start reframing the conversation, because to me, we need people at that level of government who know what they're doing. Not just the Joe Schmo that's got the Turning Point USA $1 million ad behind them and saying that, we don't want our land sold to China, because that's all I'm seeing right here in the state of Indiana. Josh, I'm going to toss it back to you, because what's coming up for me is it goes back to local control. And what kind of community do we want to envision for ourselves? It's that quality of life conversation, and it spans multiple generations.
Yeah, and it's hard right now. Like, I think there's two kind of demographics of people talking about this, right? There are people who currently own homes and are talking about this, right? You both are homeowners. And then we're seeing the younger demographics, Gen Z, young millennials, who don't own a home and feel as though the system is pretty fucked up in a way that they are never going to own a home. And if they do, like, owning a home is just for real rich people or for if your parents died at the right time. I think that is what we're seeing as well. It's just a complete unattainable thing. So we obviously talked about Section 8. We talked about, affordable housing programs, but I think housing in general is a tough subject for a lot of these younger demographics who, at their parents' age or their grandparents' age, had a house or two, and it feels like they never will actually be able to. I mean, how do we address that younger demographic and get them, they care, but they don't feel like there's any possibility for movement?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, which goes back to my question, Ryan. What states are getting this right?
You see a lot of a good traction. It's less good traction out of states and more out of municipalities. And I keep driving this back to local, but that's where most of this is happening. So
okay,
there are places like Madison, which is known for, they've had a lot of good efforts lately. Portland, they've had some issues, but they've also seen some uptick. I recently read about one of the major cities in Texas. I can't believe I'm
Austin? Is it Austin? Because I know Austin's been expanding a lot.
I think it's Austin. Austin, I might be wrong about the specific city, but they've implemented a lot of the ideas that I've mentioned so far, and they actually saw, actual no increase in their housing costs. And that's it. They're like the only ones, you know what I mean? Like it's when you look at what's happening out there, it's hard to point to a state and say they're doing something right. There are some. I can say California does a pretty good job with their funds that they submit. I know they have other issues, so this isn't a blanket praise of California, but they do a lot with CDFIs or community development financial institutions. They do a lot with like CDBG funds. They have housing authorities there that can issue a lot of bonds, and then they can purchase, naturally occurring affordable housing that's like aged and hold on to that and make sure that stays affordable. So there's definitely things to pick and choose from at the state level to say, like, this is going well. But I can't point to a specific state and be like, that we need to do exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, housing is such a hard like conversation across the board because we don't see, like, I think there's some things we can look at, like you're saying, Ryan, like we can look at a state and say, oh, they do really good at X, Y, or Z, but it's not like we're saying, oh, blue states do a great job at this, red states do a great job at this. It's just, it feels like housing has become this casualty of our economic, not to sound too, socialist over here, but it has become a has fallen through the cracks of the economic system that we have set up. And so I
Yeah.
think for voters, it feels like a lost cause. And they're just like, I just want my backyard to look, well, they're probably racist when they're saying it like that, but they want their backyard to, you know, at least not get worse. And then there's the other side of it of we just need to survive in this system. And for candidates, it's like, how do we get this across to people? And I think, and maybe you've seen stories that have worked. I'm curious, is there a concrete story that can be used to kind of, or example or theory that we can use in talking about this? Because I think when we talk in theory like this, there's a lot of numbers, section this, section that. It's like, what does all this mean? But I think concrete examples are really helpful for our candidates. And I'm curious some experiences that you might have, Ryan, that our candidates could use and share.
Yeah, there's ways to like embrace alternative methods, is what I would say. Modular homes are fantastic. Once they're placed, and modular homes are different from manufactured. I really need to make that clear. A lot of people
Yes,
are confused.
please do, because people get the stigma that a manufactured versus modular. Tell us the difference so people really understand that.
Yeah, if I were to kind of boil it down to like the most simple thing, modular homes, once they're placed, they're on a permanent foundation. They're a regular home. That's it. From then on out, regular home. Manufactured homes, you can, take the title out, you can say it's permanently on this land. It will always be a manufactured home, and it will always, it does not appreciate in value. Here's the biggest difference, really. Modular homes will appreciate the same way regular homes do. Manufactured homes are a depreciating asset. They will go down in value, and that is typically not what people want for their home if they're viewing it as any sort of investment, which a lot of people do. There's something to be said for just having homes that are affordable too. So while I personally wouldn't like make manufactured homes for sale because we're trying to like, help people kind of raise where they are economically, they should exist. I'm not here like raving against manufactured homes or anything.
Right. I think people forget what the modular homes, the goal is to build them in a controlled environment off-site. And in that process, and the way that they're building them in that process is to keep the costs down. So when they're doing those build out and those structural things, it's almost like it's the same thing. All I can think of when I think of manufacturing, or when I think of I Love Lucy, I'm dating myself. When you're coming down the assembly line, when you're doing things in groups, it makes it cheaper. It just is. When you're building 4 walls independently with the one crew that you have to hire, the costs go up. When you do it on an assembly line type of way, when it's in a controlled environment, the costs can come down. So I think that's what people have to think about with modular homes. It's just brought in pieces and then assembled instead of built on site.
Yeah.
Right?
It's
Yeah.
faster, it's built more efficient, it has better energy efficiency once it's built.
Yes.
It's built more affordable. It costs less nearly every time. And significantly less. The average cost of a home in Monroe County is about $380,000. The homes that we build new usually sell for on average about $214,000.
It's huge in terms of bringing the cost of living down and getting into home ownership. Modular homes, I want to say Denmark, it is a big thing. Now, if we were talking about modular homes here in Indiana, does that require zoning changes? Do we have to get different zoning regulations to allow modular homes to be built on property lots?
Not that I've seen, which is another big benefit of the modular home. Once it's placed, it's just a home. That is, yeah, and there's a number of manufacturers here. Even there's one in Bloomington, there's a few in Indy, very good quality products. Really, really helpful.
I think people have a negative connotation. They're not really as educated. So I think the question is, how do we talk about this to the general public? And for me, the complexity of this conversation really hones in on we've got to do more educating about what's possible. I think people feel, as Josh said, a little deflated because wages aren't keeping up with the cost of living. Wages aren't keeping up with the rising cost of housing. So it feels scary. It feels unattainable. It feels out of reach. And then when people, I know when I was working back at Lululemon, we always set goals. When you can't set a goal for your family and you feel like this goal is not attainable, you stop trying. But I think it's on candidates and community activists and people around is to know that this is fixable. Starting local is what I'm hearing is our avenue of opportunity and where we can start chiseling away at this. It's interesting too, because when we talk about local control and we talk about local zoning and what's happening on the local level, we have a tendency to follow the national narrative or even the statehouse. What was really interesting that I learned last night, one of the trainings I was doing, is a lot of townships and trustees are in the community, because it's coming from the state level, they're consolidating fire departments and moving them to volunteer fire departments in some of our areas. Now, I had a big aha last night because I didn't realize this. When you file for your home insurance policy, if you don't have a fire department, your home insurance goes up. Volunteer fire department doesn't cut it. And that was new to me. So it goes back to really understanding what's happening in your local government that's really impacting your home ownership, your cost of living, right down to utilities. We've talked a lot about data centers in other episodes, but our utilities, our zoning, fire departments are affecting your housing prices. So if I was to advise candidates right now, there's time for this. It's really educating our community about what's happening in the housing market right now and what's possible.
Yeah. And I think we need to embrace some more non-traditional methods. I told you we oversee a land trust. That's where we have a nonprofit. It owns the land. People own the houses above the land. It takes the cost of the land out of the purchase, right? So you're looking at a difference from $280,000 to $214,000. It's just, you really need to be able to explore these other options. There's things like silent second mortgages. There's Habitat for Humanity does that style. There's lots of options out there that exist, and we need to do a better job of embracing those.
Right. And it's education, because one of the things that I came up across is while we were talking about those barriers of entry in terms of zoning and modular homes and options from that housing standpoint, there's that psychological barriers to entry of educating. How do I get a mortgage? What does it really entail? There's a lot of intimidation about all the documents that you need to get to collect, your history, your people hear the word credit score and they get nervous. So how do we help educate our community that is part of the process? Yes, but how do we give them services that allows them to have an opportunity, like a counselor, to walk them through their process? And because there's a lot of fear and mistrust. I remember when my first home back in Boston that we bought, the person that walked us through was a dear friend who was in the business. So I had that trusted confidant to do that. When we came here, the company took care of it. My husband was transferred and they took care of it. So another trusted person to walk you through the process. Having community members have places to go, is that something that you see in communities that lifts up people's ability to get into home ownership when there's that entity there to help them navigate the systems?
For sure. Housing is very confusing. I don't think anyone would disagree with that, especially when you're just getting into it. It's also it's the process of purchasing a home is exhausting, right? I just bought a home in November, and I don't know if I'll ever do it again. It was such a hassle, and I do this for a living, and I'm sitting there this sucks. If you have someone who's a trusted real estate agent, if you have someone who's a trusted builder, it just helps so much. So, looking for those people. And then if you are lucky enough to live in an area that has a nonprofit that does this sort of work, that's, even talking to them, there's a lot of people that have come to us for housing, and I've directed them other places because we're not there to make money off it. We're there to make sure that people have the best option available. So if you have something like that and you're where you're at, that's a great idea.
Well, there's a question coming in. Great. Go ahead,
we have
Josh.
a question here from Zach. How do we get the housing investors in Indy or from the far north on the border that run trainings on large-scale housing projects to come up with a model for housing investments that work for rural areas?
So There's a few different things I have for this. One thing that you'll hopefully see more of is the expansion of CDFIs and the Community Development Financial Institutions. They offer low interest loans to people that are seeking to develop affordable housing. Bloomington recently got one that's very helpful. There's one in Evansville that I know of, and as those expand, Indiana will get some help in that area. The priorities that are selected for community development block grants or home funds, that helps as well. When rural areas are prioritized there, then you'll see more investment come from those areas as well. There's a certain amount of funding that comes from banks that are fed into CDFIs, and there's also a certain amount of funding from the national level that's fed in. CDFIs have a specific mandate to help invest in the community, specifically community affordable housing.
So who would be the person approaching these organizations? Would it be our state reps? Would it be our state senators? Would it be our local county commissioners to bring that development to our communities?
Generally, you would need an actual developer to do this. So that's where you kind of get into if there's an organization that works locally with you. And I guess I can put it this way. There's a group called Incremental Development Alliance. They go around to different areas and try to get them to kind of embrace small scale development and kind of like ramp up that way. There's a concept called like infill, which is where you look for lots that are in your community that are kind of decrepit, falling apart, and then someone comes in and puts a house there and sells it. That can help alleviate some of that housing burden just by creating more housing stock, which is the main way we can do this.
Okay, great. Great question. Keep the questions coming.
Yeah.
I definitely said that I'm learning a lot in this conversation.
Yeah, and I think, Ryan, you've given us a lot of information. We've talked about a lot of different things here. And so as we're kind of wrapping everything up, I'm curious, what is the one most important thing that candidates should be taking away from how we talk about attainable housing or housing in general in whatever district it is they're working in?
Yeah. Local level, again, zoning. You gotta fix that. State level, making sure that any bills that go through encourage the development of affordable housing. It sounds a little circular there, but their main job in this would probably be to uphold localities to a standard that actually makes it possible to develop. They also have some regard in deciding where these funds not are allocated, but what the priorities of these funds are, right? So there's a group that's IHCDA, it's Indiana Housing Community Development Association. I might have got that one wrong. But they have a hand in deciding what the priorities are of the funds that are distributed, and that's important. And then at the national level, making sure that programs like CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant Home Fund, all these things are well funded. If the administration gets their way and we actually go through and eliminate these programs, I try not to be like an alarmist, but that would be just devastating. Any development that you see that's community oriented has these funds in them. It is just essential to any development that is looking at the community and wanting to be invested there.